Welcome to my final presentation of my original research into the perception of musical harmony. Now, harmony is generally considered a defining aspect of music. It's present in almost all traditions and is usually considered one of the three things that make music, along with rhythm and melody. The way that we think of harmony in America and in most of the Western world has been largely defined and strongly influenced by the 18th century Western European harmonic tradition, which defined harmony or intervals between specific notes in terms of consonance, which is like a major third, which is very pleasant, stable, like pleasant, good sounding, or dissonance, which is unstable, it's wanting to go somewhere, harsh sometimes. But these aren't the only factors that can actually determine how we think about harmony. And consonance and dissonance can often be seen as essentially a construction of Western culture. Overall aesthetic preferences for note pairings vary, which suggests that there's a lot of extrinsic factors that still warrant a whole lot of research. So first, let's look at some background information. First study is the pleasantness of sensory dissonance is mediated by musical style and expertise, which was done by Tudor Popescu. This was gathered through survey method, let's look at musicians and non-musicians of all different levels of musical sophistication and expertise, who ranked the pleasantness of harmonies that were played to them. Expertise largely influenced their ratings after quantitative analysis was performed, which points to a significant degree to which Western harmony is not an inherent thing which everybody sees the same. Next, there's cultural familiarity and musical expertise impact the pleasantness of consonance/dissonance but not as perceived tension by Imre Ladelma and Tuomas Irola. This was a survey across a huge participant pool with varying levels of exposure to Western culture and, by extension, Western music, and they rated consonant and dissonant harmonies with different factors in terms of course, consonants, but also things like roughness, tension, pleasantness. They concluded overall, well, of course, they had concluded a whole lot of things from this, but very interestingly, they said that studies can essentially use consonance and tension as synonyms for the same thing because they were the most strongly correlated factors across all of the factors looked at. Finally, there's indifference to dissonance in native Amazonians reveals cultural variation in music perception by McDermott, Schultz, Unduraga, and Godoy. This survey look at different populations of Americans, Bolivians, and the Tsimane for their aesthetic responses to harmony. The Tsimane are a relatively isolated native Amazonian tribe with very little exposure to Western culture or music theory. They actually rated consonance and dissonance to be equally pleasant, even though they had Western-like aesthetic responses. This shows a significant degree to which musical preference, especially as related to harmony and consonance, can vary wildly across culture groups. Now, the impacts of harmony research are actually very unique and cross-disciplinary, with a lot of impacts in the areas of like sociology, physics, that kind of thing. But let's look at just for cognitive sciences. According to Pierce, music perception and specifically harmony perception warrant research for the ubiquity of music and harmony in everyday life and across cultures, and its interaction with the brain in a very specific way, which can be useful for things like cognitive mapping, as well as the importance of music from a sociological standpoint. Now, the research question guiding this is to what degree are correlations between perceived harmonic factors associated with musical sophistication and preferences? This is essentially new territory. Even though it's greatly based upon previous research as it's been shown before, but focusing on correlations between these perceived harmonic factors is pretty much untapped. The previous research that we've looked at so far mainly focuses on describing different groups' aesthetic responses and ratings of harmony, but looking at correlations for specific groups lets us see how different demographics essentially conflate certain factors and how they unconsciously judge the music that they're listening to. This is just a window into their unconscious perception and bias as related to music. Now, I chose a method of correlational analysis to take different groups' perception of different factors and ratings rating those factors, which looked like it was just 3 factors with consonance, pleasantness, and tension, and then correlating those with each other, and then analyzing the strength of those correlations for different self-identified subgroups to see how they conflate them. I did consider a meta-analysis, but a survey method was found to be best for simplicity and efficacy. I hosted it on Google Forms, and I had participants self-rate in terms of knowledge of music theory and performance, which from now on will be just simplified as musical sophistication, and they gave the genres that they listened to on a regular basis. They then rated 4 separate musical selections, which I composed in terms of consonance, pleasantness, and tension. To isolate harmony as a variable, all of these have the same number of notes, tempo, rhythm, and progression. To illustrate, I'll just play the first chord in each progression to show what this is actually like. So that's a 7th chord. That's one of them. That's the basic triad, a lot more consonants. That's an 11th, which is a bit more dissonance in there. And that is so dissonant, I can barely call it a chord. Going in, my hypothesis was that sophistication and preference would be highly important to almost all ratings and correlations between those ratings that would be there. And that this would point to strong determination of harmony perception by the extrinsic factors involved, like just a life experience and musical experience, etc. I yielded overall 214 responses, which led to, once the data was all collated and analyzed, had 48 separate correlations. 12 of those looked at the entire pool of responses to establish a baseline, and then 36 looked at the specific subgroups identified. So first, here we have the mean correlation coefficients for the correlation between consonance, tension, and pleasantness. I've selected the people who rated themselves most highly in sophistication, I'm calling musicians, and the people who rated them the lowest possible in sophistication, which is non-musicians. So the musicians' consonance pleasantness was actually a bit close to the mean, while the non-musicians' correlation between perceived consonance and pleasantness was significantly lower. Both of them, interestingly, their correlation between perceived consonance and perceived tension of the harmony was lower, but the non-musician was significantly weaker. And for perceived pleasantness and tension, as for the correlation constants of the non-musicians was almost right exactly at the mean, whereas the musicians were significantly lower. Now we've got correlations for different genres listeners. There were a lot of results in this category, so just for brevity's sake, I'm going to go over the absolute strongest and weakest. For the for the correlation between perceived consonance and pleasantness, the group with the strongest correlation constant for that was listeners of classical music, while the weakest was experimental. And for both the correlation between perceived consonance and tension and perceived pleasantness and tension, it was electronic and jazz who were strongest and weakest respectively. Now, overall conclusions. Firstly, the non-musician consonance pleasantness correlation was very interesting. I had expected casual music listeners to tie pleasantness to consonance, and just default to cultural norms, but the exact opposite actually happened. They had a very weak correlation, especially relative to the mean correlation between the two. This may be just a factor of the lack of knowledge of the non-musician group as to what consonance and pleasantness mean in relation to each other. The musician pleasantness and tension correlation was the lowest pleasantness tension correlation out of all surveyed subgroups. I theorize that this is because music education teaches that tension and then release is what makes music good. And so people who have that kind of education are able to separate the ideas of pleasantness and tension in their minds and be able to think, okay, this is tense, but I also believe that it is pleasant. And also, overall, the consonance pleasantness correlation for the entire group was greater than consonance tension, which looks to contradict Ladelma's conclusion that consonance and tension are the best synonyms for each other. But I'm choosing to see that this is as the exception that proves the rule. Because the participants in this study, as opposed to Ladelma and Urola's, all of the participants in this study are Westerners, meaning that the idea of musical consonance as a synonym for pleasantness is generally going to be more ingrained. Because the overall consonance tension correlation was still quite significant, this does fall in line with that. And it also shows that culture does correlate to preference strongly when we're analyzing it with respect to previous research. Now, the pleasantness tension of correlation between listeners of jazz music was very, very low. This is most likely due to the fact that jazz has just a higher baseline of tension and complicated harmonies, so they probably find tension more pleasant, and they're more able to hear tension and think that it is pleasant. The consonance pleasantness correlation for classical listeners was the strongest correlational constant in the entire study, which makes sense because they're engaging most directly with the Western musical tradition and are thus a lot more primed to think of the basic idea of consonance as being the same thing as pleasantness. Also, just for fun, I looked at the average self-reported sophistications of listeners of different genres, with the highest being classical, jazz, and R&B, and the lowest being country, rap, and pop. Overall, the sophistication and taste do predict correlations and responses to varying degrees, but even the extremes of sophistication don't always mean that their perception and their judgment is going to differ greatly from the norm in all areas. Only a few subgroups were consistently and drastically different from the mean, which does, to an extent, prove the hypothesis, or support the hypothesis. Now, for the limitations, this was only a correlative study. There was no causation investigated here, so there are no causative claims made, and that should not be taken from the study. The participant pool was largely skewed towards being secondary school age and male, which does limit the implications a bit. And there was also, this isn't necessarily a limitation as much as it is a point of distinction from other similar studies. No explanation of what the factors mean was given. This was intentional to preserve their preconceived ideas of what those factors are going in. Recommendations for future research are to, in order to solidify the importance of culture in the perception of harmony, this would be best to repeat this same study or a very similar one with non-Western audiences, and also to look at over time or possible to look into possible causative effects or explanations rather of the correlations found here through things like a case study or similar methods like an experiment. Thank you.
Terrific. Thanks, Charlie. I got a few questions for you and then we'll wrap up. So the first question is, how did you determine which results generated by your study? Because you had an ocean of data. What was the process you used to determine what you were going to put in front of us?
Yeah, that's the great thing about correlational research, and specifically looking at the correlation constants, is that it has a built-in marker of significance. Just because I was able to look at the correlational constant, whether it was strong on its own, and also whether it was very strong or very weak relative to the overall mean. The conclusions and overall data that I presented, that I was able to make a bit shorter and present here, are essentially just the ones that are most strongly different, and thus the ones that I'm a lot more comfortable in saying that this means something.
Okay. Excellent. And then as a follow-up to that, how does your findings specifically provide directions for future research in the field? You mentioned a couple of additional studies. Tie in your results with the rationale for those studies.
Right, so just because I think one of those, in that specific way, I think one of the big findings was that consonance pleasantness correlation overall was larger than consonance tension. I did theorize that this does fit in with the current body of research just because of the specifically Western participant pool, but that it does still technically conflict. So I believe that just because there is that conflict there, this does warrant the repetition of similar research with non-Western audiences, or at least audiences with different levels of cultural familiarity.
Okay, excellent. And then as a final question, if you could revisit your entire research process from beginning to end, is there anything you would change, and if so, why?
I think the biggest thing, just because if I had to do this all over again, I would attempt to define even more subgroups, maybe do things like while I'm creating subgroups, maybe do things like specifically look at data of people who rank themselves low in sophistication but liked jazz, like things like that, to get just really into the weeds and super specific with the data that I have, just to be able to get a very clear, full picture and maybe get a lot more interesting side conclusions.
Okay, excellent.